I never thought I'd be standing in my own field, arguing with a woman who believed she had the right to use my land as her personal event space. But here we were. My name is Helen Jenkins. I'm 42 years old and the proud owner of Sunflower Hill Farm, 15 acres of the most beautiful countryside you'll ever see, passed down through 3 generations of my family. My grandfather bought this land in 1947 after returning from the war. He built the farmhouse with his own 2 hands, raised my father here, who then raised me. When Dad passed 5 years ago, I promised him I'd keep the farm alive. It wasn't easy. Small farms like mine are disappearing everywhere. But I'd made it work, growing organic produce, raising free-range chickens, and keeping a small herd of goats that produce some of the best artisanal cheese in the county. The farm wasn't just my livelihood. It was my heritage, my sanctuary. Everything changed last spring when Oakwood Estates broke ground on the adjacent property. A luxury living community with houses starting at $750,000, complete with a clubhouse, swimming pool, and tennis courts. And of course, a powerful homeowners association run by Vivian Holloway. Vivian was 53, always dressed like she was heading to a country club luncheon, with that perfectly highlighted blonde bob that never moved, even in the strongest wind. From the moment we met at the neighborhood welcome party, which I attended trying to be neighborly, I could tell she saw my farm as an eyesore next to her pristine development. "You know, Helen," she'd said, swirling her Chardonnay, "your place has such rustic charm. Have you ever considered selling? I know several developers who would pay top dollar." I'd smile politely and change the subject. That became our pattern over the next few months, Vivian dropping hints about how my farm didn't quite fit the aesthetic of the area, and me brushing them off. It was a Tuesday afternoon in May when everything exploded. I was in the backfield checking on my tomato plants when I heard the unmistakable sound of vehicles coming up my private drive. Not the UPS truck or the feed delivery. These were passenger cars, at least 3 of them. I made my way around a barn to find a small convoy parked in front of my house. 2 SUVs with the logo Elegant Occasions on the side and a sleek silver Mercedes I recognized as Vivian's. For people I'd never seen before were unloading equipment from the SUVs, folding chairs, what looked like pieces of an archway, and boxes of decorations. Vivian stood in the middle of my driveway, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, directing traffic like an air traffic controller. "The chairs will go in the east meadow, by that big oak tree," she was saying, pointing toward my favorite spot on the entire property, where my father and I used to have picnics when I was a little girl. "We'll need to clear some of those wildflowers, but the tree will make a perfect backdrop for the ceremony." I felt my blood pressure rising with every word. I strode over, work boots crunching on the gravel. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "What exactly is going on here?" Vivian turned, her expression brightening with practiced charm. "Helen, perfect timing. These are the event planners for my daughter Tessa's wedding. I wanted to introduce you since we'll be using your meadow for the ceremony." The casual way she said it, like we'd already discussed this, like it was a done deal, left me momentarily speechless. "My meadow," I finally managed. "Yes, it's going to be absolutely beautiful. The wedding's in 3 weeks, June 12th. We're thinking about 250 guests, but don't worry, we'll handle all the setup and cleanup." I looked from Vivian to the event planners, who were continuing to unload equipment as if this conversation was just a minor formality. "Vivian," I said more firmly this time, "nobody asked me about hosting a wedding on my property." She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I mentioned it at the HOA meeting last month." "I thought you knew. I'm not part of your HOA. My farm isn't in Oakwood Estates." "Well, technically, no. But we're neighbors, and neighbors help each other out." Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Besides, it's just for 1 day, and the meadow is just sitting there unused." The event planner, a tall woman with a clipboard, approached us. "Mrs. Holloway, where would you like us to set up the catering tent?" Before Vivian could answer, I stepped forward. "I'm sorry, but there won't be any catering tent. There won't be any wedding. Not on my property." Now Vivian's smile disappeared entirely. "Don't be difficult, Helen. This is for my daughter. Tessa is marrying into the Reynolds family. Yes, the Reynolds of Reynolds Development Group. They're expecting a certain standard for this wedding. I don't care if she's marrying the King of England. This is private property, and I haven't given permission for any event." The event planner looked uncomfortable, glancing between us. "Is there some kind of misunderstanding?" We were told this venue was confirmed. The only misunderstanding, I said, is that Mrs. Holloway apparently thinks she can make decisions about land that doesn't belong to her. Vivian pulled me aside, her manicured nails digging into my arm. Listen, she hissed, dropping the pleasant facade. The Reynolds are extremely important people, and I've already told them about this beautiful farm venue I secured. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it would be to change plans now? That sounds like a you problem, not a me problem. The deposit for the caterers alone was $15,000. I shook my head. Again, not my problem. You should have asked before making plans involving my property. Vivian's face was turning an alarming shade of red. I'll have you know that as HOA president, your HOA has absolutely no jurisdiction over my farm, I interrupted. Now, please leave and take your wedding planners with you. That's when Vivian dropped the bomb. You don't understand, she said, lowering her voice. I've already been paid. I stared at her. What do you mean, you've been paid? She shifted uncomfortably. The Reynolds wanted something authentic for the wedding. When I mentioned the charming farm next door, they were willing to pay a premium for the setting. $20,000. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. You charged them to use my property? Without asking me? Without planning to pay me? Vivian had the audacity to look offended. I was going to surprise you with a thank you gift afterward. Maybe one of those rustic mailboxes. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman had essentially sold something that wasn't hers to sell, pocketed the money, and thought a decorative mailbox would make it all okay. Get off my property, I said quietly. All of you. Now, you're being completely unreasonable, Vivian snapped. This wedding is happening, with or without your cooperation. The invitations have been sent. The vendors are booked. You'll look like the villain here, not me. One of the event planners approached cautiously. Mrs. Holloway, if the property owner hasn't agreed, she's just playing hardball for more money, Vivian cut in. Isn't that right, Helen? That's what this is about. I shook my head, disgusted. This is about respect and basic decency. Something you clearly know nothing about. Vivian's phone rang. She checked the screen and her expression changed. It's Beatrice Reynolds, mother of the groom, she whispered to me, then answered with a syrupy, Beatrice, darling. I could hear the voice on the other end asking about the wedding venue. Vivian turned away from me, speaking loudly enough for me to hear every word. Yes, I'm actually at the farm right now. It's absolutely perfect, so authentic and charming. Helen, the owner, is a dear friend and so excited to host Tessa and Jackson's special day. My jaw dropped at the blatant lie. Vivian continued painting a picture of rustic farm wedding perfection while shooting me warning glares. When she hung up, her fake smile returned. See? It's all arranged. The Reynolds are thrilled. You just lied to those people, I said. I'm not hosting this wedding. Vivian stepped closer, dropping her voice to a threatening whisper. Listen carefully. The Reynolds family has connections everywhere. The city council, the county commission, the health department. One word from them, and suddenly your little farm operation might face all kinds of inspections and regulations. Do you really want that headache? I felt a chill run down my spine. Was she actually threatening me? Are you blackmailing me on my own property? Vivian stepped back, composing herself. Of course not. I'm simply pointing out that being accommodating here could benefit you, while being difficult could have consequences. Before I could respond, the event planners started setting up measuring tapes in my meadow. They were already marking spots for the altar. Stop, I called out. I haven't agreed to anything. Vivian checked her watch. I have another appointment. The planners will finish their preliminary work today. We can discuss the details later when you've had time to think about it more. Rationally, she strode back to her Mercedes as if the matter was settled. The event planners looked confused but continued their work. I stood there, fists clenched, watching as strangers trampled through my meadow, planning to transform my family's land for their purposes without my consent. And something inside me snapped. This was just the beginning. If Vivian Holloway thought she could bulldoze over me and my farm, she was about to learn a very painful lesson about property rights and about messing with a third-generation farmer who wasn't going anywhere. After the confrontation with Vivian, I spent the night researching property laws and calling everyone I knew with legal experience. By morning, I was armed with knowledge and fury. I marched out to my east meadow at 6 a.m. to find something that made my blood boil. Overnight, someone had mowed down a section of my wildflowers and placed little flags marking where rows of chairs would go. They'd even hammered in stakes where the wedding arch would stand. This was trespassing, pure and simple. I was taking photos for evidence when a sleek black SUV rolled up my driveway. A young couple emerged, the woman a carbon copy of Vivian but 25 years younger, the man tall with the confident bearing of old money. "You must be Helen," the woman said, extending her hand with a practiced smile. "I'm Tessa Holloway, and this is my fiancé, Jackson Reynolds. Mom told us there was a little misunderstanding about our wedding venue." "There's no misunderstanding," I replied, not taking her hand. "Your mother tried to sell you access to property that doesn't belong to her." "That's fraud, not a misunderstanding." Jackson frowned. "We paid $20,000 for this venue." "You paid Vivian." "I never saw a dime, never agreed to anything." Tessa's smile faltered. "But Mom said you were friends, that you were doing this as a favor." "Your mother and I are not friends. We're barely acquaintances." "Look," Jackson said, his tone condescending. "We understand you might want more money." "That's fair. Let's talk numbers." I shook my head. "This isn't about money. It's about respect. Your future mother-in-law trespassed on my property, damaged my crops, and tried to strong-arm me into hosting an event I never agreed to." Tessa's eyes narrowed, suddenly looking exactly like Vivian. "Do you have any idea who we are?" "My fiancé's family. Owns half the county, has connections everywhere, I know." "Your mother already tried that threat." Jackson put his arm around Tessa. "Let's approach this differently. What would make this work for you, Helen? Name your price." I was about to repeat that it wasn't about money when my phone rang. It was my friend Nora from the farmer's market. "Helen, you need to see this," she said without preamble. "Check your email now." I opened the message to find screenshots from Facebook and Instagram. My jaw dropped. There were dozens of posts from Oakwood Estates residents showcasing a day at the farm experiences on Y Farm. Photos of children petting Y goats, families picnicking in Y meadows, even yoga classes being held next to Y pond. And the caption on one post made everything clear: "Another wonderful farm experience organized by our amazing HOA president, Vivian. Worth every penny of the activity fee." "They've been doing this for months," Nora explained. "My cousin lives in Oakwood. Vivian's been charging residents $75 per person for authentic farm experiences on weekends when you're at the farmers markets." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. While I was away selling my produce, Vivian had been selling access to my farm without my knowledge. The wedding wasn't a one-time thing. It was just the most brazen example of her ongoing scheme. I looked up at Tessa and Jackson, fury building inside me. "I need you both to leave. Now." "We're not done discussing," Jackson began. "Oh, we're done," I said, showing them the screenshots. "Your wedding is just part of your mother's ongoing trespassing business. I'm calling the sheriff." Their expressions changed as they saw the evidence. Tessa looked genuinely shocked. "Mom's been charging people to use your farm without permission. Apparently, it's the family business," I said coldly. Jackson took the phone, studying the images with a frown. When he handed it back, his arrogance had diminished. "I didn't know about this." "Well, now you do. And now you know why there will be no wedding here." As they drove away, I called the sheriff's office. Deputy Wells arrived an hour later, but his response was infuriatingly passive. "It's a civil matter, Ms. Jenkins. We can document the trespass, but since there's no property damage, they cut down my wildflowers. No significant property damage," he amended. "It's really something for the courts to handle." I could read between the lines. The Reynolds name carried weight, even with law enforcement. "So I'm just supposed to let them take over my property?" Deputy Wells looked uncomfortable. "I can speak to Mrs. Holloway, but legally." He shrugged. "You might want to consult an attorney." After he left, I called every lawyer in the county. Most wouldn't even consider taking on the Reynolds family. Those who wanted retainers I couldn't afford. By afternoon, I received an email from Vivian with a contract attached, a formal agreement for using my farm as a wedding venue, with a payment of $5,000 offered as a gesture of goodwill. The email concluded with, "I'm sure we can put yesterday's misunderstanding behind us and move forward like good neighbors." She was still acting like this was happening, with or without my consent. Then my phone exploded with notifications. Vivian had created a social media event for the wedding, complete with professional photos of my farm taken without permission. She tagged me in posts describing our partnership to create the most charming rustic wedding venue in the county. The comments were flowing in from her country club friends, all exclaiming how excited they were to attend the event at Helen's beautiful farm. She was creating a public narrative that I'd agreed to this, making it harder for me to back out without looking like the villain. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by legal documents I couldn't afford to file and cease and desist letters no one would enforce. I felt trapped and powerless on my own land. Then I remembered something my father used to say: sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store and bought every "no trespassing" and private property sign they had. I spent the day hammering them into the ground along every inch of my property line, especially the border with Oakwood Estates. I installed security cameras at key points around the farm, focusing on the areas where Vivian's farm experiences had been taking place. I changed the locks on all the gates and reinforced the fencing. And I called a locksmith to install a heavy-duty gate across my driveway, one that required a code to enter. As I worked, Vivian called repeatedly. I didn't answer. She sent increasingly desperate texts. "What are you doing? We need access for the florist tomorrow. The Reynolds are coming to see the space this weekend. Stop being childish, Helen. This wedding is happening." Finally, she showed up in person, screeching to a halt in front of my new gate, honking furiously when she couldn't get through. I walked down to meet her, staying on my side of the gate. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, gesturing at the gate and signs. "This is what securing private property looks like," I replied calmly. "No one enters without my permission. You can't do this. The wedding is in 2 weeks. Your wedding is not my problem." I never agreed to host it. Her face contorted with rage. "I've already told everyone. That's fraud, Vivian. You sold something that wasn't yours to sell. The Reynolds will destroy you," she hissed. I smiled. "I've been told they have excellent attorneys. Perhaps they'd be interested to know how you've been profiting from trespassing on my property for months. I have quite a collection of social media posts showing your little business venture." For the first time, I saw fear flash across Vivian's perfect features. She knew I had her. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice lower now. "I want you to leave me and my farm alone. Cancel the wedding plans here, tell the truth to your HOA members about your unauthorized farm experiences, and return every penny you collected for access to my property." "That's ridiculous. I can't possibly." "Then I look forward to meeting the Reynolds family in court," I said, turning to walk away. "Wait," Vivian called. "Maybe we can compromise." I paused. "The only compromise is this: you have 24 hours to come clean and make this right. After that, I'm taking everything I have to the Reynolds family, the sheriff, and a lawyer who's very interested in taking this case on contingency." This was a bluff. I hadn't found such a lawyer. But Vivian didn't know that. As I walked back to my house, I felt a weight lifting. For the first time since this began, I was the one in control. Vivian had overplayed her hand, and now she was the one scrambling. Little did I know the real showdown was still to come. And it would be more public and dramatic than anything I could have imagined. The 24 hours I gave Vivian came and went with no resolution. What I did receive was a formal letter from someone claiming to be the Reynolds family attorney, threatening legal action if I continued to interfere with contracted wedding arrangements. The letter was on impressive letterhead but missing a bar number, a detail my research told me was required on all legal correspondence from attorneys in our state. Another bluff. I was starting to see how Vivian operated. For the next week, I documented everything. Every unauthorized vehicle that approached my property. Every social media post about the upcoming wedding. I even captured footage of Vivian and 2 men attempting to access my farm through the backfields at dawn, presumably to set up more wedding infrastructure. My new security system caught them red-handed, and the look on Vivian's face when my automated warning system announced they were being recorded was priceless. Meanwhile, I took a calculated risk and created a simple website, The Truth About Oakwood Estates Wedding Venue Scam. I uploaded all my evidence, screenshots of the unauthorized farm experiences, photos of the trespassing, timestamps, and a detailed timeline of events. I didn't publish it yet, but it was ready to go live with one click. 10 days before the wedding, I received an email from Jackson Reynolds himself, requesting a meeting. Alone. I agreed but insisted on a public location, the local coffee shop in town. I arrived early, chose a table with a clear view of the door, and waited. Jackson arrived precisely on time, dressed more casually than before, looking troubled. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, sitting down across from me. "What can I do for you, Mr. Reynolds?" I kept my tone businesslike. He sighed. "I want to apologize. After our conversation, I did some digging. You were right about everything." I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "Vivian has been charging our HOA members for access to your farm for months. She collected over $30,000 in activity fees that were supposedly going to a local farm cooperative, which doesn't exist. And the $20,000 we paid for our wedding venue. She kept $15,000 and only allocated $5,000 to you, which you never even agreed to." "I'm aware," I said calmly. "The thing is," he continued, looking genuinely distressed, "my family's reputation is important. If it became public that our wedding was part of some fraudulent scheme, that would be uncomfortable for you," I finished. He nodded. "Very. But more importantly, it's wrong. Tessa had no idea what her mother was doing. She's devastated." For the first time, I felt a twinge of sympathy. Maybe the daughter wasn't just a younger Vivian after all. "What are you proposing?" I asked. "We've canceled all plans to hold our wedding on your property. We found an actual event venue with availability due to a last-minute cancellation. It's costing us significantly more, but it's legitimate." And Vivian, his expression hardened. "That's where I could use your help. She's refusing to return the money she collected, claiming she has expenses. And she hasn't told anyone that the wedding location has changed." I wasn't surprised. "When is she planning to inform your 250 guests?" "That's just it, she's not. She still thinks she can somehow force you to host the wedding." I couldn't help but laugh. "She's delusional. My father, Theodore, is a property attorney," Jackson said. "He's reviewed your case and believes you have grounds for significant legal action against Vivian personally, separate from the HOA. He's willing to represent you pro bono." Now that was unexpected. Why would he do that? Frankly, because he's furious at being deceived, and because my mother's family has history with Vivian that makes this particularly galling to him. Also, he believes in property rights. I considered this. "And what do you want from me in return?" "Just discretion. Handle this however you need to with Vivian, but keep Tessa's name out of it as much as possible. She's humiliated enough." That seemed reasonable. We shook hands, and I left with Theodore Reynolds' business card and a promise that he'd call me that afternoon. The next day, June 11th, just one day before the supposed wedding, everything came to a head. Theodore had indeed called, confirming everything Jackson had said and adding that he had subpoenaed Vivian's bank records. The numbers were even worse than we thought. I was in my barn when I heard the commotion. A convoy of vehicles was parked at my gate. Catering trucks, florists, rental companies, and in the center of it all, Vivian's Mercedes. I activated my phone to record and walked down to the gate. Vivian was in full meltdown mode, screaming into her phone while gesturing wildly at my locked gate. When she saw me approaching, she jabbed her finger in my direction. "There she is, the woman who's ruining my daughter's wedding." A crowd of confused vendors watched as I calmly walked up to my side of the gate. "Ms. Jenkins," one of them said, "we have a delivery for the Holloway Reynolds wedding. We were told to set up today for tomorrow's event. I'm sorry, but there's no wedding happening here. This is private property, and no event has been authorized." The vendor looked confused, then turned to Vivian. "Mrs. Holloway, you assured us this was all arranged." Vivian's face was scarlet. "It is arranged. Helen is just being difficult. She's trying to extort more money at the last minute." That's when a sleek black Lexus pulled up, and an older man in an impeccable suit stepped out. Theodore Reynolds had arrived, right on cue. "Mrs. Holloway," he called, striding toward us. "I believe there's been a miscommunication. The Reynolds family has relocated the wedding to the Grand Pavilion in Lakeside. All vendors should report there immediately." Vivian looked like she'd been slapped. "What? No. Theodore, what are you doing?" "Protecting my son from fraud," he said calmly, then turned to the vendors. "Please check your emails. The updated location information was sent this morning." My apologies for any confusion. The vendors began checking their phones, nodding as they found the emails. One by one, they began to pack up and leave, heading for the legitimate venue. Vivian lunged at Theodore, grabbing his arm. "You can't do this. Do you know how much work I've put into this? The deposits I've paid. The deposits you paid with money fraudulently obtained," Theodore corrected, gently removing her hand. "Including funds you took from my son while misrepresenting your ownership of this farm." Vivian turned to me, desperate now. "Helen, please, we can work something out. I'll split the money with you, 50-50. "That's an interesting offer," I said, "considering you previously didn't intend to give me any of the money you collected for use of my property." Theodore handed me a thick envelope. "Ms. Jenkins, these are the legal documents we discussed. A restraining order against Mrs. Holloway, prohibiting her from entering your property or misrepresenting it in any way. Also included is the civil suit for damages, which I filed this morning." Vivian's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. "You're suing me? This is absurd. I'm the victim here." Just then, another car pulled up, Deputy Wells from the sheriff's office. "Right on time," Theodore noted. "I took the liberty of filing a criminal complaint as well. Fraud exceeding $50,000 is a felony in this state." Deputy Wells approached, looking far more serious than during his previous visit. "Mrs. Holloway, I need to speak with you regarding allegations of criminal fraud and trespassing." Vivian's perfect facade finally cracked completely. She began screaming that we were all conspiring against her, that her daughter's wedding was ruined, that her reputation in the community would be destroyed. "You did this to yourself, Vivian," I said quietly. "All you had to do was ask permission instead of assuming you could take whatever you wanted." As Deputy Wells escorted a still-ranting Vivian to his patrol car, Theodore turned to me. "I hope you don't mind the dramatic timing. My wife always says I have a flair for the theatrical in my legal work." I couldn't help but smile. Not at all. It was quite satisfying, actually. "The civil case is strong," he continued. "The HOA board has already called an emergency meeting to remove her as president. She'll likely face criminal charges as well, though she may plead bargain. What about all the money she took? We'll recover what we can. My firm will ensure you're compensated for the unauthorized use of your property." The fallout was swift and comprehensive. Vivian was removed as HOA president that same day. The local paper ran a front-page story about the farm access fraud scheme, careful to note that Tessa and Jackson were victims, not participants. True to my word to Jackson, I never mentioned Tessa in any of my statements. The wedding did take place the next day at the Grand Pavilion. Tessa sent me a handwritten apology note afterward, along with a beautiful gift basket of local artisanal foods, not from her mother's favorite luxury store, but from my fellow vendors at the farmer's market. It was a thoughtful gesture that suggested she might be nothing like Vivian after all. As for the HOA members who had unknowingly trespassed on my property during Vivian's farm experiences, most were horrified to learn they'd been part of something illegal. Several reached out with apologies and offers to make it right. That gave me an idea. 6 months later, Sunflower Hill Farm officially opened its doors as a legitimate event venue and educational center. With proper permits, insurance, and infrastructure, I now host school field trips, farm-to-table dinners, and yes, even the occasional wedding. The lawsuit settlement provided the seed money, and Theodore Reynolds became both a mentor and friend, helping me navigate the business side of turning my family heritage into something sustainable for the future. Ironically, Vivian's horrible scheme led to something wonderful. My farm is thriving now, with additional income that ensures I can keep it in the family for generations to come. As for Vivian, last I heard she'd moved to Florida after her divorce. Apparently, this wasn't her first fraudulent scheme, just the first time she'd been caught. The no trespassing signs remain, though. Not because I'm unwelcoming, but as a reminder that respect and permission matter. Whether you're an HOA president or anyone else, no one has the right to take what isn't theirs. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting property, it's about protecting principles. And that's a lesson worth remembering, no matter how big or powerful the trespasser might be.